The stars stretched endlessly across the darkness, shining like scattered diamonds on black velvet. For centuries, the Galactic Empire had looked at these stars with a sense of ownership. To them, the galaxy was theirs. Planet after planet had fallen under their banners, their fleets moving like storms that swept away resistance. Whole civilizations had bowed their heads, forced into silence by the overwhelming might of the Empire's warships. To them, no one could stand against their authority. Their ships were enormous, built like floating cities armed with weapons powerful enough to level entire continents. Their name alone carried fear, and so when strange new signals were detected on the outer edges of their controlled territory, the Empire paid attention, but not with worry. No, they looked at the new intruder with the same arrogance they always carried, as if this was just another small species to bring under their control. The first report came from one of their border outposts. At first, the officers thought it was interference, some kind of natural radio noise caused by distant stars. But soon the signals grew clear. They weren't random at all. They were structured, deliberate, and timed. Someone out there was broadcasting. Someone was moving in their space, and they were not afraid of being heard. That caught the Empire's attention. Usually, smaller civilizations went silent once they realized the Empire had noticed them. Fear always silenced the weak, but this new arrival did the opposite. Their signals were louder, bolder, filled with patterns the Empire didn't immediately understand. When the outpost finally sent visuals, the Council gathered to review them. On the massive screens in the high chamber of the Empire, a fleet appeared, smaller than the mighty armadas of the Empire, but striking in their formation. These were not ragged ships of traders or desperate explorers. No, these vessels moved with precision, each one sliding into perfect position like dancers in a performance. They were human ships, Terran ships, though the Empire did not know their name yet. The officers in the chamber whispered among themselves. They looked nothing like the grand floating citadels of the Empire. They were sharp, compact, built not for glory but for function. They looked fast. They looked ready. The Emperor's advisors chuckled at the sight. To them it was a curiosity, nothing more. Another primitive race, one of the generals said. They have no idea what they are walking into. The others nodded in agreement. Across the galaxy, species had risen and fallen. They had challenged the Empire before, and all of them had been reduced to dust in time. What were these Terrans compared to centuries of dominance? To the generals and admirals, they were just another name that would be erased. The Empire's pride blinded them from seeing what was really before them. But out in the depths of space, the Terran fleet was not afraid. Their communications were intercepted, but to the Empire's confusion, they weren't desperate cries or nervous orders. Instead, they heard something strange: laughter. Jokes passed between ships. Casual voices spoke about the beauty of the stars, about how their engines sounded, about how their maneuvers looked from different angles. To the Empire, this was baffling. Who laughed on the eve of battle? Who joked when faced with the most powerful military force in the known galaxy? The more the Empire listened, the more they grew irritated. They mistook the calm of the Terrans for arrogance. They could not see that it was something else entirely. It was confidence, the kind born not from overwhelming firepower but from surviving in places no one else could. The Terrans were different from the countless civilizations the Empire had crushed. They were a species shaped on a world that had never forgiven weakness. Their home was a place of storms, predators, and constant struggle. Their history was filled with wars, disasters, and hardships, yet they had endured. Every scar of their past had taught them how to adapt, how to rise again when the world tried to crush them. It was this spirit that carried them into the stars. They did not come with massive ships built to intimidate. They came with determination, strategy, and a willingness to fight against impossible odds. The Empire had no way of knowing this yet. All they saw were smaller ships moving toward their borders, and they smiled at the thought of conquest. As the fleets drew closer, scouts sent back more images. The Terran fleet was not vast in number. It could not compare to the endless lines of Imperial warships. But the way they moved sent a chill down the spines of the few Imperial officers who truly studied them. The Terrans did not fly like the other civilizations. They did not keep their ships in stiff, rigid formations. Instead, they shifted and flowed, adjusting smoothly as though anticipating attacks before they even came. It was not the movement of a fleet marching to its death. It was the movement of hunters who had studied their prey and were ready to strike. Still, The Empire did not take them seriously. To them it was almost entertainment. In their grand halls, commanders prepared speeches about dominance and surrender. They planned the ways they would demand obedience from the humans once the battle was won. They thought of the new resources they would strip from this world called Earth. And above all, they thought of how quickly the Terrans would kneel once they realized they faced the might of the Empire. But the Terrans were not coming to kneel. They came smiling. In every intercepted voice, in every signal the Empire captured, there was a strange joy. It was not madness. It was not arrogance. It was the thrill of challenge, the excitement of proving themselves once again. Humanity had always been underestimated. By nature, by each other, by the universe itself. And every time they had risen. This time would be no different. The Empire believed fear would break them. The Terrans believed fear was nothing compared to the will to fight. That was the difference, and though the Empire could not yet see it, that difference would soon shake the galaxy. The Empire had always taken pride in its massive fleets, and why wouldn't it? For generations, no force in the galaxy had ever been able to stand against them. Their warships were so large that from a distance they looked like small moons drifting through space. They carried thousands of soldiers, endless weapon arrays, and thick armor that entire planets could not hope to crack. With so much power at their command, it was natural for them to believe no one could threaten their rule. And so, when the Terran fleet appeared at the edge of their domain, most Imperial commanders dismissed the sight with laughter. To the Empire, humanity was just another species that had dared to wander too far. They assumed the Terrans had no understanding of the strength they were about to face. They must not know who we are, some of the admirals said with pride. The thought that anyone could face them willingly seemed absurd. Fear had always been their greatest weapon, and in every encounter before it had worked perfectly. Civilizations folded before a single Imperial fleet, surrendering before even a single shot was fired. Why should this be any different? And yet the longer the Empire observed the humans, the more unsettled some of their officers became. Intercepted transmissions were reviewed in great detail. What they found was confusing. There were no desperate pleas for survival, no trembling voices begging to be spared. Instead, the humans spoke with ease. Their words were casual, sometimes even light-hearted, as though they were not preparing for the largest confrontation of their lives, but simply going about their day. Some laughed. Some joked. Some spoke of strategies as if they were discussing a game. To the Empire, this was incomprehensible. To laugh before facing the most powerful armada in the galaxy? It was insulting. The High Council of the Empire met in their grand chamber to discuss the matter. Their golden walls reflected the glow of thousands of candles, and the air was thick with pride. One advisor stood tall and declared that the Terrans were arrogant fools, nothing more than children playing at war. Another nodded and said, "Let them laugh now. Their voices will turn to silence soon enough." The chamber filled with agreement. No one questioned the outcome. To them, the battle was already won before it even began. But outside the walls of their chamber, away from the arrogance of their leaders, a few officers felt something strange. They looked at the patterns of the Terran fleet and saw discipline, not recklessness. They noticed how the ships did not simply follow a rigid order, but flowed around one another like water, adjusting quickly to each change. This was not the movement of amateurs. This was not arrogance, it was experience. But their voices were drowned out in the echo of the Empire's pride. No one in power wished to believe that humans could be dangerous. The Terrans, meanwhile, showed no fear. To them, this was not the first time they had been outnumbered. It was not the first time they had been underestimated. On their own world, they had faced challenges far greater than themselves. From violent storms that could tear apart whole regions, to predators that stalked them in the dark, to wars they waged among themselves, every struggle had sharpened them. Survival was in their nature. And so, when they looked at the massive armadas of the Empire, they did not see certain death. They saw a challenge worth meeting. The Empire believed that size alone was enough to crush opposition, but the Terrans believed something else entirely, that a sharp mind and quick thinking could overcome the largest of threats. They knew their ships were not as big. They knew they did not have as many weapons. Yet none of that mattered. What mattered was their ability to adapt, to think differently, and to use every weakness the Empire revealed. To the humans, this battle was not about proving who had the largest guns. It was about proving that cleverness could stand against sheer power. As the fleets drew closer, the Empire began preparing their displays of strength. Their warships spread across the star system like a wall of metal. Each ship carried banners that glowed with the symbols of the Empire, meant to intimidate and overwhelm. It was a show of force, a reminder of their dominance. The Empire wanted the humans to see this and realize the hopelessness of their situation. They wanted the Terrans to break before the first shot was ever fired, but the Terrans did not break. Instead, they kept advancing, their smaller ships sliding effortlessly into position. Their fleet looked almost insignificant compared to the towering giants of the Empire. But there was something about the way they moved that unsettled even the most confident Imperial captains. They were precise, sharp, almost too calm. The humans were not panicking. They were not hesitating. They were ready. One Imperial commander, frustrated by the calmness of the Terrans, ordered all intercepted transmissions to be played in the War Council. When the voices filled the chamber, the room was stunned. "Do they not understand who we are?" One general hissed, his pride burning with anger. The laughter of the humans echoed in the Golden Hall, filling the silence between the general's outrage. "They think this is amusing. They think we are a joke?" Another shouted. But beneath their anger was something they refused to admit: fear. Not fear of the humans themselves, but fear of the unknown. For centuries, they had known exactly how every species reacted to them: fear, submission, silence. The Terrans gave them something new, and the unknown always carried danger. The Emperor, however, silenced the chamber with a single command. His voice, deep and proud, declared that humanity would fall just like all the others. "Let them laugh," he said. "Soon they will learn what it means to face the Empire." The room erupted with approval, and the decision was made. The Empire would unleash its fleets not just to defeat the Terrans, but to crush them so completely that no other species would dare to imitate their boldness. Far away, in the cold silence of space, the Terrans continued their preparations. Their crews checked weapons, adjusted engines, and shared words of encouragement. They did not speak of death. They did not speak of surrender. Instead, they spoke of possibilities, of strategies, of clever maneuvers, of finding ways to strike where the Empire least expected. And through it all, there was one constant: the quiet confidence that had carried them through every trial before. The Empire believed the Terrans were blind to the danger before them. But the truth was different. The Terrans knew exactly what they were walking into. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the Empire's ships could dwarf their own. But still they smiled. Because to humanity, there was something exhilarating about standing on the edge of the impossible. And if there was one thing humanity had always loved, it was proving the impossible wrong. The stage was set. The Empire prepared its storm. The Terrans sharpened their resolve. And somewhere in the silent space between the two fleets, the future of the galaxy began to tremble. The silence of space hung heavy as the two fleets finally came face to face. On one side, the Empire's armada stretched across the starfield like a wall of steel. Their warships glowed with bright insignias and bristled with weapons, each one larger than the Terran vessels by several times. On the other side, the Terran fleet held its ground. They looked smaller, their numbers fewer, but their formation was tight, steady, and unshaken. It was like watching a pack of wolves standing against a herd of massive beasts. The difference in size was obvious, but the confidence was striking. The Empire made the first move. It had always been their way to strike hard and fast, overwhelming their enemies with power before resistance could even begin. Orders echoed through the Imperial ships, and suddenly the stillness of space exploded with light. Enormous beams of energy cut across the void, filling the darkness with burning trails. Hundreds of cannons fired at once, their combined firepower enough to erase entire continents. The sheer brightness of the attack turned the battlefield into a temporary sun. To most civilizations, such a display would have been the end. But the Terrans did not crumble. The Terran ships moved in ways that caught the Empire off guard. Instead of holding rigid lines, they shifted quickly, darting between fire as if they had known exactly when and where the shots would come. Their ships twisted and spun, using their smaller size as an advantage. They moved like fish weaving through a net, slipping between the gaps of the Empire's attacks. Where Imperial commanders expected chaos and destruction, they found something else entirely: discipline mixed with unpredictability. The Terrans weren't retreating. They were advancing, From the bridge of one Imperial battleship, officers shouted in disbelief as their weapons missed again and again. How could smaller ships avoid so much fire? Their formations were supposed to trap the enemy. Yet the humans seemed to turn those very traps into pathways. Each burst of fire that should have cornered them instead became an opening, and through those openings the Terrans slipped closer and closer. Then came the moment that truly shook the Empire. The Terrans struck back. Their weapons weren't as massive, not nearly as loud or blinding as the Imperial cannons. But they were precise. A sudden blast of missiles cut through the void, targeting weak points the Empire had never considered vulnerable. One Imperial cruiser shuddered as its shields failed, pierced not by overwhelming power but by accuracy. Sparks flared across its hull before it spun out of formation, trailing fire. Another ship soon followed, then another. For every barrage the Empire unleashed, the Terrans answered with strikes that seemed almost playful in their timing. The laughter and calm voices of Terran pilots continued to filter through intercepted signals. The Empire expected screams or desperation, but what they heard unsettled them deeply. Jokes exchanged between crews, calm discussions of tactics as if they were playing a game of strategy rather than facing certain death. "They're smiling," one Imperial officer whispered to himself in disbelief. "They're actually smiling while fighting us." The battle grew fiercer. The Empire unleashed wave after wave of fire, determined to crush the smaller fleet. Explosions lit the battlefield as Terran ships were caught, some disappearing in brilliant flashes of destruction. But even as losses mounted, the humans adapted faster. For every ship destroyed, the survivors adjusted their approach. They darted behind asteroids, used gravity from nearby planets, and even turned wreckage into cover. Every loss became a lesson. Every moment sharpened their response. The Empire, however, struggled with its own size. Their massive warships, once symbols of power, now became weaknesses. They were too large to maneuver quickly. Their formations, meant to intimidate, made them predictable, and the Terrans exploited this with every passing minute. Small groups of human ships would lure a massive Imperial vessel out of position, then strike it from behind where its shields were weaker. Other Terrans used coordinated attacks, hitting multiple points on a single ship until the armor cracked. What the Empire thought was a simple extermination was quickly turning into a war they could not fully control. Imperial commanders barked orders with rising panic. Some demanded tighter formations. Others ordered full retreats to regroup. But the Terrans refused to give them time. They pressed forward with relentless energy, their smaller fleet weaving between the giants like shadows. Every shot they fired was deliberate. Every maneuver seemed designed to test the Empire's patience. And slowly, the unthinkable began to happen. Imperial losses grew. One by one, the Empire's massive ships were forced out of the fight. Some were crippled, their engines destroyed. Others erupted in fire, torn apart from inside as Terran strikes found hidden vulnerabilities. Entire sectors of the Imperial wall of steel began to crack, leaving gaps that the Terrans slipped through. And all the while the humans kept that same unnerving tone, calm, confident, almost joyful. They weren't afraid. They weren't desperate. They were alive in the fight. The Empire had never faced an enemy like this. They were used to fear, to broken spirits, to enemies crushed before they even began. But the Terrans gave them none of that. Instead, they gave them laughter, determination, and a fight that refused to end. For every ship the Empire destroyed, the Terrans answered with a counter that left a scar. For every roar of Imperial cannons, there was the quiet, steady smile of a human fleet refusing to bow. At one point, an Imperial commander slammed his fist against his console, shouting that the humans were mad. "They should be running," he cried out, "but they're enjoying this." His officers stared at the screen in silence, watching as the smaller fleet danced among their giants, each movement a display of skill and daring. It was as if the Terrans had been waiting for this moment all along. The battle raged on, neither side fully breaking, but something had already shifted. The Empire had expected victory within minutes. Instead, hours passed, and still the Terrans held. Still they pushed forward. Still they smiled. And in that smile was the truth the Empire had refused to see. Humanity was not just another primitive race. They were something different, something dangerous. They were survivors, and survivors did not fall easily. When the first great Imperial warship exploded in a chain of fire, lighting up the battlefield like a second star, the Terrans did not cheer. They simply moved forward, steady and sure, as though victory was never in doubt. The Empire stared in disbelief, their pride shaking for the first time in centuries. This was not supposed to happen. This was not the way the galaxy worked. Yet here it was, unfolding before their very eyes. The first clash between the Terran fleet and the Empire did not end in total victory for either side. But the message was clear. Humanity had stood against the strongest power in the galaxy and had not broken. They had faced overwhelming firepower, massive ships, and endless arrogance, and they had smiled through it all. The Empire began to understand, though they would not admit it yet. This battle was not the end. It was only the beginning, and for the first time in countless years the galaxy trembled not at the Empire's roar, but at the quiet, fearless smile of humanity. The battlefield had become a storm of fire and wreckage. Pieces of broken ships drifted through the darkness, glowing faintly as they burned away into nothing. The Empire's armada, though still enormous, no longer looked invincible. Its perfect wall of ships had cracks, and those cracks were growing wider. For the first time in centuries, the Empire was not just fighting, it was struggling. And it was struggling against a force it had dismissed as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The Terran fleet was still smaller, still outgunned, but something about the way they fought was beginning to shift the balance. The humans had studied every move of the Empire, every formation, every tactic, and now they were turning those lessons into weapons. They were no longer just dodging and surviving. They were attacking with purpose, hitting weak spots with precision and retreating before the Empire could strike back effectively. It was not brute force. It was patience, cleverness, and the kind of determination that the Empire had never truly faced before. From the bridges of Imperial ships, officers stared in disbelief as one of their mighty cruisers erupted in a chain of explosions. Its shields had been targeted again and again in the same exact spot until finally they gave way. The humans had known exactly where to strike, and once the opening was made, they poured their fire through it. To the Empire, this was humiliating. Their fleets were supposed to be untouchable. Their ships were meant to crush any resistance. Yet here they were, falling to attacks from smaller vessels that fought as if the laws of battle meant nothing to them. The Empire tried to adapt. Orders were sent across the battlefield to tighten formations, to close ranks and press forward. But the very size of their ships worked against them. They could not move as quickly, could not shift with the same agility as the Terran fleet. Whenever they tried to trap the humans, the Terrans slipped through like smoke. Whenever they tried to overwhelm them with fire, the Terrans scattered and regrouped, attacking from angles the Empire hadn't considered. For every adjustment the Empire made, the humans answered with something unexpected. It became clear that the battle was no longer about numbers. It was about flexibility. The Empire was powerful, yes, but it was also rigid. Its fleets fought the same way they had for centuries, using the same tactics, the same confidence that had always won them wars. The Terrans, however, had no such patterns. They adapted constantly, shifting strategies with every passing minute. Their movements were unpredictable, their attacks unconventional. What the Empire saw as recklessness was in truth a sharp instinct to survive. And then came the moment when the tide truly began to turn. A squad of Terran ships broke off from the main formation, darting dangerously close to a massive Imperial battleship. The Empire assumed it was desperation, a last attempt before being destroyed. The battleship's cannons roared, filling the space around them with fire, but the Terrans didn't retreat. They kept moving closer, weaving between the blasts with impossible precision. At the last second, they released a spread of warheads that struck the battleship's engines. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire rear of the giant ship tore apart, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The Empire's commanders stared in silence as one of their greatest weapons was left crippled, drifting helplessly into the void. The Terran fleet did not pause to celebrate. They simply moved on to the next target, steady and relentless. It was as though they had planned for this moment, as though they had expected from the beginning that victory was possible. Their voices, still calm, still filled with quiet confidence, echoed through the intercepted transmissions. They spoke of the next strike, the next maneuver, never once acknowledging the fear the Empire had expected to hear. To the humans, the battle was not chaos. It was a challenge they were meeting with clear eyes and steady hearts. The Empire's officers grew desperate. They began shouting orders, some contradicting one another. Panic spread across their ranks as more ships were lost. They had entered this fight believing it would be easy. They had assumed the Terrans would be broken within minutes. Now hours had passed, and it was their own fleet that looked ready to break. The arrogance that had carried them into the fight was gone, replaced with something far heavier: doubt. The humans, however, seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. Their losses did not weaken them. Instead, every fallen ship was used as fuel for determination. Every wrecked hull became a reminder of what was at stake, and with every attack, they showed the galaxy that they were not fighting for conquest, but for survival, for pride, for the simple truth that no empire had the right to decide their fate. That spirit, more than their weapons or their ships, was what turned the battle. At one point, a formation of Terran ships used a field of debris as cover, weaving through the remains of destroyed vessels to hide their movements. When an Imperial squadron chased them, the humans ambushed from behind, striking so quickly that the Imperials barely had time to respond. Another group of Terran ships used the pull of a nearby planet's gravity to slingshot themselves at impossible speeds, tearing through Imperial lines before the enemy could react. These were tactics no manual could prepare for, no simulation could predict. They were born from instinct, from creativity, from the human ability to see opportunity even in disaster. And slowly, the Empire realized it was not just losing ships, it was losing control. The humans had taken the rhythm of the battle into their own hands. The Empire was no longer dictating the flow. The Terrans were. Still, the Empire fought fiercely. Their cannons roared, their massive ships pushed forward, and their sheer numbers remained terrifying. But something had shifted deep inside the heart of the battle. For the first time in centuries, the Empire was not feared. It was resisted. And worse, it was being outsmarted. From the outer edges of the fight, smaller civilizations who had been watching from afar began to whisper. Word traveled fast across the stars. The unthinkable was happening. A small fleet from a small world called Earth was standing against the might of the Empire and holding its ground. To many it was unbelievable. To others it was inspiring. The galaxy had lived too long in the Empire's shadow. Now, for the first time, that shadow looked less permanent. The turning point was not just in the battle itself. It was in the spirit of those who watched, and in the realization spreading even within the Empire's own ranks. The humans were not simply another opponent. They were something entirely new. They were survivors who refused to surrender, fighters who smiled even in the face of overwhelming power, and that smile, more than any weapon, was what unsettled the Empire the most. As the battle raged on, the Empire began to feel something it had not felt in generations: fear. Not fear of destruction, for their fleets were still vast and powerful, but fear of change, fear that the galaxy they had ruled so easily was beginning to slip from their grasp, fear that this small, stubborn species had lit a fire that could not be put out. By the time the fighting began to slow, the Empire had lost more than ships. It had lost certainty, and the Terrans, though bloodied and battered, stood tall among the wreckage. They had turned the tide not with size or strength, but with resilience, wit, and a refusal to bow. The Empire had underestimated them. Now it knew the truth. The battle was not over, but the future had already shifted. And for the first time in living memory, the Empire faced an enemy it could not simply crush. It faced humanity, and humanity had proven that it could not be broken. The battlefield was silent for a brief moment after the clash ended. In the vast emptiness of space, debris floated like broken pieces of history, each fragment carrying the story of a fight no one had expected humanity to win. The stars shone cold and distant, but for the humans who had fought, they felt brighter than ever before. For the first time in centuries, the Galactic Empire had been pushed back, and it wasn't by another empire, not by some ancient rival, but by humans, the very species that the Empire once dismissed as insignificant. The Terran fleet, though smaller, now stood proudly amidst the ruins. The scars on their ships told of sacrifice and resilience, yet the humans inside were not weighed down by despair. Instead, they carried a strange sense of delight, as if they had just proven something vital not only to the galaxy, but also to themselves. Humanity had always lived on the edge of survival. On Earth, they had faced storms, disasters, and wars. In space, they had battled starvation, radiation, and the endless cold. All of it had made them tougher than any empire could ever imagine. Across the surviving ships, laughter could be heard through open comms. Not laughter of mockery, but of relief and pride. It was the sound of a species that refused to bow down, even when facing odds stacked against them. Some soldiers were exhausted, some wounded, but their spirits remained unbroken. They had fought as though this battle wasn't just about survival. It was about identity. Humanity had shown the galaxy that they were not weak, they were not prey. They were predators of circumstance, molded by hardship and carried forward by an unshakable will. On the other side, the Galactic Empire was reeling. Their commanders, who once walked with arrogance, now stood in disbelief. Reports poured in. Losses beyond expectation, tactics they could not predict, and an enemy that smiled in the face of destruction. For generations, the Empire had crushed civilizations with overwhelming power. Yet here was a fleet so small in number, so young in history, and still it had managed to humiliate them. The shock rippled through their ranks, shaking their faith in superiority. But for humanity, this was not just about winning a battle. It was about setting a message that echoed across the stars. Other civilizations, long oppressed by the Empire, began to take notice. Word traveled faster than light, about the Terrans, about their strange way of fighting, about their laughter during war. Whispers turned into stories, stories turned into inspiration. Those who had lived under the Empire's shadow started to wonder if they too could stand, if they too could resist. Humanity had unknowingly become a symbol, not just for themselves but for countless others who had lost hope. Within the Terran fleet, leaders gathered to assess the outcome. Their ships had endured heavy damage, but their spirits were stronger than ever. They knew this battle would not end the Empire. In fact, it might only provoke greater retaliation. But instead of fear, the humans felt something else, a sense of joy, of anticipation. The challenge excited them. They were Deathworlders, born from a planet that never allowed weakness. Every new trial was an opportunity to prove their worth. The more the Empire pushed, the more humanity would rise. Some among them wondered if peace was possible, if the Empire would ever respect them without more bloodshed. Others believed that conflict was inevitable, and that humans had to prepare for a longer war. But what united them all was the pride that came from standing their ground. For the first time in galactic history, the Empire had been forced to look into the eyes of a species that did not tremble, did not surrender, and instead smiled back with unshaken defiance. In the days that followed, the battlefield became more than wreckage. It became a monument. Ships from nearby systems came quietly to see what had happened. Survivors of other conquered worlds whispered prayers of thanks not to gods but to the Terrans who had done the unthinkable. The sight of broken Imperial warships floating beside human vessels became a story passed down through channels hidden from the Empire. A story that would ignite sparks of rebellion in places far away. Humanity, meanwhile, did not seek to rule or dominate. They were not conquerors in the old sense. What they wanted was respect, freedom, and the right to stand without being crushed. Their smile, which the Empire had found unsettling, was a reflection of this deeper truth. Humans smiled because they had endured the impossible before, and they would endure it again. They smiled because they saw every confrontation as another test of their spirit, not an end to it. The Galactic Empire, for all its size and power, had learned something valuable in that battle. They had faced countless species before, but never one like this. Other civilizations submitted out of fear, but humans fought with a strange mixture of joy and stubbornness. It wasn't just their weapons that made them dangerous, it was their hearts, their minds, their refusal to be predictable. Against such a force, numbers and technology meant little. The Empire could destroy fleets, but it could never destroy the human will. As humanity prepared for the next stage of the conflict, they carried with them the lessons of this first great clash. They knew the Empire would return stronger, angry or unwilling to accept defeat. But instead of dreading it, humanity embraced the thought. They were ready. They had always been ready. For generations, Earth had forged them into survivors, and now the galaxy would see the result of that long, merciless training. The story of this battle would echo for centuries. It would be told around campfires on distant colonies, whispered in secret meetings by oppressed worlds, and studied in academies of strategy. People would remember the day when the Galactic Empire confronted the Terran fleet and discovered something they had never seen before. A smile. A smile that carried the weight of history, the defiance of survival, and the promise of a future where humanity would no longer be underestimated. And so, in the quiet after the storm, As stars continued to shine and ships began their slow return, one truth became clear. Humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or their ships. It was their spirit. A spirit that turned fear into laughter, hardship into pride, and battles into moments of delight. That spirit would carry them into the future no matter how dark or uncertain, because humanity had already proven one undeniable fact. They would always rise, and they would rise smiling.